And welcome to Riverside Episcopal Church. Our podcast each and every week is where faith, community, and everyday life intertwine. We believe in being guided by God's Word and embracing every heart. You're invited to join us each and every Sunday at 10 a.m., and you can find more about us at riversidemcalla.org. So we want to bring you this week's sermon from Rev Cameron Nations.
All right, well, I hope y'all are feeling blessed this morning. Maybe not. We'll see. So I have to admit to y'all out of the gate, this is one of those sermons this morning that hangs together in my head and my heart, and I am just praying it also hangs together when I preach it, okay? I do want to talk about blessing this morning, what it means to be blessed, and the kind of complicated nature, actually, that blessing takes in our lives sometimes. And I want to begin by asking you a question that we'll come back to later in the sermon, which is this. What has God in this season, perhaps we'll limit it to whatever this season of life is for you. What has God in this season given you an abundance of? An abundance of. Okay, let's think about that. Hold that in your head, and we'll come back to that question later. So I do want to talk about blessing this morning, and to get there, I want us to begin, and really to focus on our reading from Genesis, where we hear one of God's promises that he makes to soon-to-be Abraham. Notice that it's Abram here, so the covenant hasn't been made yet, but it's Abram at this point. And God says quite plainly to him, he says, look, Abram, I'm going to bless you, right? I'm going to bless you. Your name is going to be great. Your descendants will be numerous, and you will be blessed. Blessed materially with this land that I'm going to give you, and blessed with many, many people who will trace their ancestry back to you. But that's not all that God says, right? God says, I will bless you so that what? You will be a blessing. Not just that I'm going to bless you, right? But I'm going to bless you so that you will be a blessing. In other words, I'm going to bless you, Abram, so that you will have the capacity to bless others. So that you will bless others. Now, I think there's an important central fact about the nature of God and God's blessing buried in here. Now, often when we think of blessing, we think of gift, abundance, and often material abundance, right? This is what we associate with blessing. We think of the luxury vacation. We think of the good brunch. We think of the promotion at work or the new car, et cetera, et cetera. This is what we think of as blessing. And actually, that's kind of what it's meaning here in this passage, right? I mean, God is talking about material abundance with Abram here. But we also know that material abundance is not to be equated purely with blessing, and that blessing itself is somewhat more complicated. Now, okay, I already got ahead of my notes. I want us to note here that it does make sense. It seems like something God would do to give Abram material abundance and then to say, you're going to be generous with this, right? I'm blessing you with these things so that you can, not just so that you'll hoard them or hold on to them, but actually you'll use that material abundance to bless others. That does sound like something God would do, right? God calls us to be generous with what we have. And so, and to use what we have to be shared as a means of relationship and communion between people. I mean, this is part of why God calls us to be generous, is not just so that people's needs will be met, but actually so that we will be knit together in community. Abundance is sort of the means of community and community building. So this does make sense, right? Okay, God's saying, I'm going to bless you, you will bless others. But we know that blessing is a little more complicated, and we know this from a reading that we had not that long ago. You may remember a couple of months ago, we had a gospel reading, famous passage from the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. Remember, Greg preached on this. And in the Beatitudes, we actually hear some things that complicate this notion that blessing equals material abundance, right? Y'all may remember these. Blessed are the poor in spirit. It's actually the first one. That's how Jesus comes out of the gate, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit. That doesn't feel very abundant, right? Blessed are those who mourn. That doesn't sound like the luxury vacation or the good meal, right? Blessed are the meek. And then it goes on. And finally, we get to blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, right? I mean, that doesn't sound like the Instagrammable moment that we would all hope for when we talk about what it means to be blessed. And so this is what I mean when I say that blessing is a little bit more complicated, isn't it? So what do we do with this? Perhaps all of these things sound, these things being the things Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, those may sound perhaps a little more like what your season of life may be abundant with at this time. Right? Sometimes we have these seasons of abundance where things are going well, life is going good, we have little to complain about, but then we've all been in seasons where the abundance seems to be in the other direction, right? Where the list of things we can complain about seems to outweigh the list of things that we might give thanks for instance. And so what does it look like to understand God's blessing in the midst of the mess and complication of our lives? What would it mean for God to bless these qualities, the sort of hard times in our lives, as much as the times when we think that things are going well? So again, I return to that question that I asked at the beginning of the sermon. What has God in this season given you an abundance of? Now, maybe you are this morning facing a really challenging circumstance. Yet perhaps God has blessed you, is blessing you, or will be blessing you with an abundance of grace and peace in the midst of those challenges. Maybe this morning you find yourself standing at the edge of deep uncertainty. And yet maybe God is blessing you, has blessed you, will bless you with an abundance of faith and trust at the edge of that uncertain place. And sure, actually, maybe God has blessed you in this season with a happy season of ease and material provision, where things are going well and you find yourself with an abundance of resources and goodwill. And perhaps God is blessing you and calling you to share that abundance. But the truth of our lives is that our circumstances may not always feel like blessings, or at least what we would associate with blessing, right? But the blessing is how God can work in and through those circumstances to knit us closer together, to bring us closer to the love that lies at the heart and the root of all things. Because as I mentioned, that's part of blessing. Part of blessing is actually a means of knitting us together in communion with one another and with God. That's part of what it means to be blessed. That's part of why God was giving Abram that land and the material wealth that would come with it, was to be shared, not hoarded, right? I'm struck also by this future tense that we see here in Genesis. It's not just that I'm blessing you so that you will be blessed or that you are blessed. It's I'm blessing you that you will be a blessing in the future, right? Because sometimes the blessing of our present moment isn't realized until sometime later. Instant gratification doesn't always come from God. It's very frustrating, actually, right? This past Friday, Carly and I hosted our pastoral care lay leadership cohort. You know, we've been doing these lay leadership pathways. A few who are here this morning have participated in those. And for our final session with the pastoral care folks, the folks who over the last 6 months have been reading and thinking and reflecting on what it looks like to provide care in the life of the church and how to care for others, We hosted them for dinner at our house, and we had our final discussion to end the course around a dinner table, which was a very different vibe than Zoom, actually. Very different vibe than Zoom. It was lovely. And we reflected on many of the topics and questions that had arisen for us in the course of our sessions. And one of the things that came up is the way that our own pain, grief, and trouble actually can often become our greatest gift, a blessing, if you will, that allows us to go with others and journey with them to help them navigate their own pain and grief. It allows us to travel farther with them than maybe we ever would have been able to do otherwise. One of our number is actually a widow who serves her own congregation by caring for others. And her experience of death and loss, the death and loss of her husband, has become the very thing that has enabled her to travel with others navigating the same grief and loss. It's the wellspring from which she draws her desire to be a pastoral presence to those in her congregation and community. And now I want to be clear here. It doesn't mean, and I'm not trying to say that the tragedy of her husband's death is good, right? I'm not saying that at all. That absolutely is bad. It is tragic. It is hard. Her grief is real. And God, let it be said, grieves alongside her. And I'm sure that while she was going through that season as her husband died, the idea of God's blessing in her life might have felt somewhat remote. The blessing isn't her husband's death. Rather, it's the widow's love transformed into care for others facing their own unimaginable grief that has become the blessing that knits her community together. Do you see what I'm saying? This is the thing that's hanging together in my head and my heart, but that I'm afraid won't come through in the sermon I'm preaching today. Again, sometimes the blessing isn't realized until later and we don't see it. Now, I don't know if this is going to help or hurt my point, if this is going to make it clearer or more fuzzy, but there is a clip from a show that came up to me in my mind and my heart when I was preparing this sermon. It's actually a segment from Doctor Who. Anybody watch Doctor Who? Okay, great. We at least have one. If you don't, this still will make sense. But about 16 years ago, there was an episode of the show, Doctor Who, that makes me think about all of this. And for those of you who don't know, I'll just butcher this horrendously, but all you need to know is that Doctor Who deals with time travel. He gets in a police box, and anyway, all you need to know is time travel's involved, okay, in the show. And in this particular episode, the doctor visits the painter Vincent van Gogh, okay? I don't know. Some of you may have seen this. There's this clip actually, that makes its way around the internet every so often, but it's so powerful. Anyway, they go to visit Van Gogh, who, of course, was famously, very famously, unappreciated in his own time, right? He was not a famous painter when he lived. He never saw his fame realized. He was tormented throughout his life by numerous mental health issues that ultimately led to his own tragic death at the age of only 37, right? I mean, famously the archetype of the tortured artist, right? So anyway, the doctor brings Van Gogh to modern day Paris, to the Musée d'Orsay, one of the most famous art museums in the world. And he leads Van Gogh through all of these rooms, displaying exhibits from painters who are Van Gogh's own contemporaries. And because they're British, they say Van Gogh, but I'm not going to say that. Anyway, so folks or paintings by Monet, Gauguin, right? All of these contemporaries who Van Gogh looked up to, wanted to be sought to be in his own time. And then they go to a specially designed wing of the museum that exists solely to house some of Van Gogh's most famous works of art, right? I mean, all the greatest hits in this room. And Van Gogh is stunned, right? He's looking around and seeing all of these paintings that in his time were basically in a closet in his in-laws' house. And the doctor pulls a curator aside, played by the actor Bill Nighy, who I love. And he pulls this curator aside and asks him, within earshot of Van Gogh, he says, so in 100 words, where do you think that Van Gogh rates in the history of art? And Nye's character responds, well, to me, Van Gogh is the finest painter of them all. Certainly the most popular great painter of all time, the most beloved. He transformed the pain of his tormented life into ecstatic beauty. Pain is easy to portray, he says, but to use your passion and your pain to portray the ecstasy and joy and magnificence of our world, no one had ever done it before, and perhaps no one will ever do it again. And Van Gogh begins crying. You also begin crying at this part in the scene. And the doctor moves to comfort him and apologizes. He says, I'm sorry if this is all too much, he says. And Van Gogh responds, no, these are tears of joy, right? Because in this moment, he sees that what absolutely didn't feel like blessing at the time blessed so many others, right? That in the messiness and the pain and the struggle came something beautiful and life-giving that has knit together people in relationship for decades and decades and will do so for centuries more. Now, unfortunately, we don't all have the benefit of a time-traveling Doctor Who that can bring us that moment of closure sometimes to some of our own stories, wondering what it means to have an abundance of something that doesn't always feel like blessing. And as I said, this is the part that I really want to be clear about. It wasn't Van Gogh's severe mental health struggles that were the blessing, right? It's not that God gave him those episodes of delirium so that somehow we might enjoy some pretty pictures. That's not what I mean to say. I think that isn't it. But rather that his pain and struggle is what we see and identify with in the beauty that he created. That there's something in that is a blessing to us that he offered. So friends, this morning, God has blessed you, is blessing you, so that you might be a blessing too. And I pray this morning that even if you're in a season that doesn't feel much like a blessing, you would be open to see the abundance of grace and mercy that will transform it into one. Amen.
We are a community of believers striving to live out our faith into the world, and this inspiring message, a part of each and every Sunday. You're invited to join us, and to find out more, easy to do. Just go to riversidemccullough.org.